I want to start from the word razor in the title. And the particular razor I'm referring to is something called Occam's razor, which is partly covered by the Zoom thing. Sorry, let me just get this out of the way. Okay, great. As I'm sure most of you will be aware of, Occam's razor is this philosophical principle traditionally attributed to Wilhelm Occam that states more or less that when adjudicating between competing explanations for a set of given facts that you may be observing, it's a good idea to go for simpler explanations over than more complex ones. Of course, this doesn't mean that the simplest explanation is always the best. It's just essentially a prescription to, all else being equal, have a bias towards simplicity. I don't want to get into the philosophical underpinnings of this, but generally speaking, if you're skeptical, you may think that if you're trying to interpret a series of facts, simpler explanations may be a good idea because they may involve fewer assumptions, so they may be easier to falsify or test, or they may be less likely to somehow over-explain irrelevant details in the facts that you're observing. Right. To start getting a little bit more concrete about what I want to talk about is I want to see how this plays out in the context of statistical inference or learning. Consider, for instance, this cartoon statistical problem, right? Imagine that you have the dots here are the facts that you're considering, and you're considering multiple explanations which are given by this different, functions that you may be fitting to this data, right? The idea here is that, the prescription of Occam's razor here is that, you may be able to get some very close description of the data by choosing a very high degree polynomial that interprets exactly all of your data set. But at the same time, this is probably a bad idea because it's going to do, wild things when you're trying to interpolate between existing data points. And, we all have this intuition that this is highly likely to be overfitting your data. So there's this sense that you may want to approach your data using some model that is flexible enough to capture the kind of main structures that are hidden within it, but you don't want to overdo the flexibility of your model, right? So more generally in statistical inference, there's all sorts of devices that kind of incorporate or implement this idea of simplicity bias, right? Just to give you a couple of examples that you may be familiar with, when you're thinking of model selection criteria that you may be using when you're trying to analyze some empirical data, such as the archaic information criterion or the Bayesian information criterion, essentially what these criteria say is that if you have multiple statistical models for a set of data, you have to compare them based on a figure of merit, which is composed by one term here, which is essentially a log likelihood, which captures a degree of goodness of fit, so how closely your model kind of hugs the data. But you should temper this measure of goodness of fit with a penalty that depends on the number of parameters of your model. And the idea here is that models with many parameters are somehow more complex models, right? And for instance, these two criteria do this in a kind of somewhat different way, but conceptually the link to the idea of Occam's razor is the same, right? So, and there's all sorts of other devices in statistical inference, machine learning, et cetera, that kind of reflect or implement this assumption. But the general idea is always that you're going to be trading off some measure of descriptiveness or goodness of fit of your model with respect to your data in exchange for a little bit of simplicity, because you expect that simplicity is good for some reason, like the ones that we just mentioned. So, but apart from the kind of like the theoretical and philosophical background behind this, the main, the reason why we use this sort of prescriptions in analyzing, data in practice is that it works, right? It gives us more robust ways of inferring, kind of extracting patterns from data, and it gives us better ways of making more solid predictions about what's going to happen next, right? So it's something that works in practice. So it kind of stands to reason that we may want to consider this principle of simplicity as a kind of normative reference point for what the brain, seen as an information processes device, may be doing when essentially carrying out perceptual and cognitive functions, right? So the questions that I want to ask is, you can imagine asking this at different levels within the brain, but again, as I was mentioning at the beginning, we're only going to be talking about behavior today. So the main question, first question is, can we ask whether do people have a bias towards simplicity when doing this operation, comparing between alternative explanations for some sensory data? And most importantly, if they do, can we go beyond just saying that they do have a preference? Can we somehow quantify and characterize quantitatively the form of this bias? So how this bias works? What can we say quantitatively about it? Okay. So in order to make some progress on this question, I want to dig down a little bit more in the methodological framework that I'm going to be using. And we're going to use something called Bayesian model selection, which some of you might already be experts of. So it goes as follows. Imagine that you have some empirical data, call it X, something that we observe, and then you have some models. Here for simplicity, let's just assume we have two. Let's call them M1 and M2. By model here, I mean a parametric family of probability distributions. We'll see an example in a second. Then because, for reasons that will become apparent, we want to be in a Bayesian setting. The moment we choose some models, we want to choose priors, right? We need a prior over, the models themselves. And here, again, for simplicity, again, we're just going to take a flat prior over models. So we're going to assume that the two models that we consider are a priori equally likely. And then each model is going to have parameters. So we need to equip them with a prior, right? So we need to select a prior for the parameters of each model, which we're going to take uninformative here. I'm not going to maybe dig too much about what this means. It just, let's just say that we're putting priors over the parameters of the models that essentially mean that, we assume that we don't know very much about this. About these parameters, right? So given this setting and these assumptions, what we're going to do here is we're just going to apply the standard machinery of Bayesian inference. So essentially what we want is we want to calculate the posterior probability of the two models. That because we have only two of them, we can just encapsulate it as a posterior ratio. Probability, posterior probability of model one given the data versus probability of model two given the data. Essentially, this is what we want to understand, right? Which one is the best, is a good description of the data. So in order to compute this, we're going to consider the following object. So this, so each model by its own is going to give us the likelihood function. So the likelihood function is what typically you consider as essentially the definition of the model. Is something that looks like this. Imagine that you have your model is a one-dimensional Gaussian. So again, parametric family of probability distribution, right? So this is a probability distribution with a parameter here. I'm just saying, imagine that your standard deviation is 1, and the only thing you don't know is the mean of the standard deviation. So this is your one parameter. Okay, so you need this function, which is the definition of the model. And then you're interested in computing this object, which we call the evidence or the marginal likelihood. So this is just what you get if you take the likelihood and marginalize away the parameters using the prior. In other words, essentially, it means how likely is the data given your a priori assumptions about the model. Okay, if you just take your model and the prior parameters that you assume, how likely it is that you observe the data that you've actually observed. Okay, so why is this object important? This object is important because, remember, we want to compute this ratio here, but just by basic application of Bayes' theorem, you can just write it like this, as a product of a ratio between these marginal evidences. I lost my cursor. Okay, here, between this ratio between marginal evidences times the ratio of the priors. But because, again, for simplicity, we assume that the priors are the same. It turns out that this quantity that you want to compute is simply the ratio between the two evidences of the model. Okay, so essentially, if we can compute this evidence, we're essentially done. So this is the key object that we're going to want to compute. So so in the context, again, so here it is this integral here, right? So we're going to see that the one nice property of this Bayesian model selection framework is that it will give us this Occam's razor, this bias for simplicity, just as a byproduct of application of this very general principles. Till now, here in this slide, I didn't say anything about simplicity, right? I was just talking about how do you do essentially Bayesian inference, which is really just basic Bayesian inference. And we're going to see that this bias for simplicity kind of drops out of the theory for free. We don't need to assume that we want something simple, right? It's just going to come from the theory. Okay, so let me explain it with a cartoon. So imagine that you observe a particular phenomenon, which is, say, you're seeing an apple that is falling from a tree, okay? And you want to understand, what could be the cause for this, right? You have two alternative models for how this may happen. So one is something that I just summarize as writing by ethical as I may, just kind of like classical mechanics, Newtonian gravitation, what have you, right? So that's one set of kind of framework that could explain the particular way in which the apple fell from a tree. The alternative explanation here, for instance, is there was a ghost, right? There was a ghost that decided to pluck the apple from the tree and kind of smash it into the ground at exactly the type of the acceleration rate that you may expect from a free-falling apple. Okay, so what does our framework say in this scenario? So consider the classical mechanics case. So when the classical mechanics can explain the particular trajectory that you have observed, but it can also explain a range of other phenomena that you may have observed, but you didn't, right? Which are all kind of tightly constrained by the laws of physics, right? Because depending, for instance, if you assume that there was some other initial velocity to the apple, that it would have traced out some other parabolic curve in falling down, but it would still be some sort of parabola, right? Okay, so it could have explained a range of other phenomena, which is relatively tightly constrained. Whereas if you assume that the ghost was the cause for what you saw, well, then in that case, all bets are off, right? So the other things that could have happened under the assumptions could have been anything, right? The apple could have gone anywhere with following any type of trajectory. So what does this mean for this quantity, the evidence that I was talking about a moment ago? If you imagine placing all the possible kind of scenarios that you may have observed on this kind of abstract axis here on the x, you can imagine that, for instance, say the apple falling from the tree at the particular way that you observed is here, right? Imagine that is represented by this point here. And what we're saying is that the probability, if you consider the probability that each of your two models assigns to this particular observation, what we're saying here with these two curves is that both models could have explained it, right? The difference is that the range of facts that classical mechanics can explain is narrower than the range of facts that the ghost can explain, right? The ghost is a more flexible explanation. It's good for many more things, right? So just as a side effect of the fact that this evidence is just a probability distribution over possible observations, because the ghost explanation is kind of broader, it will also tend to be lower for things that can be explained by both, right? So the idea here is that if you do observe something that can be explained by the ghost, but not classical mechanics, then yeah, I mean, of course, if you see the apple floating away, it's probably a ghost. But if you do observe something that can be explained by both explanations, then the evidence for the more rigid explanation will tend to be higher. And so Bayesian model selection will tell you, yeah, you should go with the simpler or more tightly constrained explanation. Okay, so that's the cartoon version of it. Yes?
So this is kind of an effect of you imagining an extremely broad range of actions for this ghost.
Mm-hmm.
You can imagine a very incapable ghost that
right.
can only throw straight down.
Okay, yes. So you mean
so the speed would actually be way narrower than ethical damage.
Yes, of course. And that's very easy to falsify, because if you ever observe an apple falling from some other different way, you know that ghost is not a good explanation for that scenario, right? So that's the advantage of simple explanations, right? Yes. Okay. Right. Now let's get into something that's a little bit more quantitative. The idea is that, okay, so this simplicity drops out automatically from this scenario, And the nice thing is that under certain regularity assumptions, you can actually, so this thing is generally speaking an ugly, complicated integral, right? But you can approximate this integral with something called, we may call here the Fisher information approximation, which is essentially an asymptotic expansion of the log of this quantity in the number of available data points. So I'm not going to go too much in the details of the math here, but the idea is that this Bayesian evidence will break down in a series of terms, each of which has a distinct geometrical interpretation. You can formalize this into tools of information geometry, right? So the idea is that here you have, so the first term will give you, this is your measure of goodness of fit, like it's the log likelihood of your model at the maximum likelihood point. Okay, so essentially it's telling you, in this schematics here, the star kind of represents the data and the bars or the dot here represents the explanations, right? The models. So here the idea is that your likelihood here is capturing, if you want, the distance between the data and your model. So it's telling you, yeah, okay, you should go for a model that is close to the data. And the others are all penalties. They all have the opposite sign, okay? And they capture different geometrical properties of this model. So this one is called dimensionality, and it counts the number of parameters of the model, and it also depends on the number of samples. This one, I'm not going to interpret the equation, but it kind of captures the presence of boundaries in your models. This one here measures the volume of your model in just 1 second, in terms of for instance, the length of this bar, so we'll see in a second. And this one that we call robustness is related to the curvature of your model in proximity of the maximum likelihood point. Question?
I was just scratching.
Okay, great. Yes. Okay, so fine. I mean, again, let's not delve too much. We can talk later about the maths of this. Okay, so one the key takeaway from here is that essentially, if you start from this idea of Bayesian model selection, then you break down this Bayesian evidence, you will see dropping out of the theory terms that are intuitively kind of close to our notion of complexity. For instance, the number of parameters of a model, or the kind of the size of the model, the width of the the space of possible behaviors that the model can describe, right? These are all captured by this thing, which is neat. There is also generalization of the Bayesian information criterion I mentioned earlier, which is just this thing arrested at the first term in this asymptotic expansion. And also it has connections with things like the minimum description length and predictive information. Cool. So how do we use this in practice? Imagine that you have one model. For this one model, you can compute all of these terms that I will call, this is L for likelihood, D for dimensionality, B for boundary, V for volume, and R for robustness. You can compute the same quantities for some other model. And then, of course, this quantity that you want to compute just takes this very simple form using this particular expansion. Yes?
In singular learning theory,
yes,
you have this local learning coefficient quantity.
Intuitively, I would say that's somehow related to the robustness quantity. Is that intuition correct?
So I'm not sure about that specific. I'm not too familiar with the thing you're mentioning. But one thing that happens that you need to be careful here is that this works if like away from singularities of your model. But there are ways of correcting for it. So if your model, like if your geometry starts to collapse, you need to take into account, and you can bridge. This robustness thing actually is more similar to, essentially we can show that it's like some sort of embedding curvature of your model in like the smallest locally flat exponential family you can embed it in, something like that. It's like
regular models.
Yes. Yeah, like baby steps here, is it? Yes. Okay, cool. So this particular framework that I just explained suggests naturally suggests this experimental setting that I'm gonna tell you. So imagine that you wanna test human behavior in this scenario where people are deciding between competing explanations, right? So imagine that you have this scenario here where your data is a bunch of dots in 2 dimensions, right? The data are the black dots. And the possible explanations are 2 families of Gaussians that are centered around two possible lines. So for instance, imagine your model 2 is the family of all Gaussians with known and kind of unit, whatever variance, centered somewhere along this line, okay? And model 1 is the same, only with Gaussian centered around this line. That's the, the mathematical form is over there. Okay, then you apply the machinery there just described. And one nice thing is that for this particular type of very, very simple model, you can compute analytically all of the terms that I just described. And it turns out that, for instance, this likelihood term that I was telling you, oh, it's some sort of distance, turns out to be, it's a sum of squared errors, so it kind of makes sense. Your dimensionality is, in this case, they're a one-dimensional model, so it's something which just contains a 1 here. Boundary here, we don't really, in this particular scenario, we don't care too much. We would care about it if the data was kind of close to the boundaries, but not in this particular example. The volume, as I was telling you, this is really the volume. Like if you compute the integral that was on the previous slide, you will find out that your volume term is just the log of the length of your model in units of the noise. So it's really like how many distinguishable probability distributions you can fit in this model here. And in this scenario, the robustness is 0 because this is flat, but you can also consider models that are curved. This one will have a non-zero robustness term. Okay, so then the theory, again, was telling us that this is how you should decide between the two models. And this kind of suggests to perform this sort of experiment with humans and essentially model their behavior by sticking a free parameter in front of each of these features of the models to measure how sensitive people are to each of these particular notions of complexity. Right, so essentially this is what we're going to do for the next couple of slides. So consider this particular, so that we're going to do exactly that, right, with 4 different tasks, each of which is kind of designed to probe particularly one of these different terms of this expansion. So here you see 2 models with different dimensionality, 1 and 0. Here these things are configured in a way to make boundaries important. These have different volume, and those are different curvature. Okay. So we run this thing with like 200 subjects. It's a pre-registered experiment. And essentially what we get is, actually, let me zoom in. Yes, let me zoom in one of these plots to show you qualitatively the type of data that we get. So here I'm showing model 1, model 2. I'm not showing the data, right? Because data on every kind of trial of the experiment is this dot that I was showing you before. But what I'm showing you is this pink or green shade, which tells you on average across all of the participants, whether people are more likely to choose the dot or the line as the best model for the data. At the same time, the blue line is the locus of points that are equidistant from the 2 models. So in other words, this should be your decision. The blue line should be your decision boundary if you're just gonna pick the model that is simply closest to the data, right? So if you're just gonna go for the model that is that has the best goodness of fit. Question.
I like to really understand what the participants are doing. So can you say what they exactly see and what they do?
Yes. So participants are, if I can go back. Essentially, participants are seeing something that looks like this without the gray shade. Let me just go back a little bit more. I'm sorry. That's this low. Okay, we're gonna get there. So imagine that you're seeing this without also the M1 and M2, and also without colors. So I'm showing you the dots. I'm telling you, there is a whole cover story when we explain to the subject that these things are like 2 flower beds from competing gardeners, and these flowers are dropping seeds. There is a whole story about it because you cannot say to the subjects that these are point samples from some isotropic Gaussian distribution, because it's not going to go down very well. And essentially, they need to they have the sense that this data comes on every trial of the experiment. These data, the data points, they all come from one point on one of the 2 models, and they need to pick which one do you think they think is the best. So basically, they show this, and I have to say, oh, maybe the top model here, the green one, is the one that I think is most likely to have generated this data. Does it help?
Do they see 1 point at a time or?
No, they see 10 points. They see this.
10 points. And
Yes, they see 10 points at a time.
The cover story is that it's a flower bed, and then
Yeah, so
I like to understand what the participants. I'm psychologist.
yeah. So yes, so the cover story. Sorry, I don't have I had a more expanded slide somewhere with all the schematic of the experiment. But the cover story is that these are 2 flower beds. They belong to 2 different gardeners. Each night, 1 flower among one of the 2 flower beds drops a bunch of seeds, and they are exposed before this to just like gradually, like for instance, we show, we start we have a tutorial that starts with like, this is a flower, shows a flower, and then it kind of boils it down to a point, and then it starts showing like, oh, this flower can drop seeds. And then it shows a bunch of examples that allow the subjects to internalize essentially the spread over which the dots are going to fall from the generating point.
Both M1 and M2 have an equal amount of flowers.
Yeah, so we say that M1 and M2 are equally likely to, something from M1 or something from M2 are equally likely to, to drop seeds on any given night. And then any point within M1 and any point within M2 is equally likely to generate seeds.
They think there's a uniform distribution over M2.
Yes. Okay, thank you. So yes. Okay, let's keep going. So yes. So basically I was saying this is your decision boundary that you should adopt if you think that essentially simplicity or complexity of your models doesn't matter. And green versus pink is just in the aggregate what subjects are doing, right? This is some sort of very simple kind of k-nearest neighbor interpolation over the whole population of 200 subjects. So what this is showing is that if you focus on this kind of central location here, is that there is a fairly wide area of the kind of the data space such that when the data is falling there, subjects are not choosing the closest model. They're actually preferring the model that is further apart, which happens to be the simplest one, okay? So which kind of goes in the direction that we were expecting from our theory of Occam's razor, right? So this should be the razor. Okay, right, so the idea is that this is just the kind of the data, okay? And then we can analyze this data, and I have similar things for the other features. You can analyze this data in that framework that I was talking about. So what that means is that you can infer each of these beta terms, which I call sensitivities, for each of these features of the model. So these plots here, they show the sensitivity, for instance, for dimensionality. Each dot here is a different participant, and this gray distribution here is some sort of population level. If you think about it as an average estimate of the sensitivity. Okay, so the 2 vertical lines here are, so the blue one is what you would expect in the behavior of somebody who didn't care at all, just did maximum likelihood, so didn't care at all about simplicity. And the orange line is what you would expect from an ideal Bayesian observer, which would follow the Occam's mandate religiously. Immediately what you can see is that, of course, there is a fair amount of spread in individual behavior, as this is not surprising. But you can see that participants are generally sensitive to most features, to all of the features, even though the quantitatively their sensitivity doesn't really coincide with what you expect normatively. Okay. Okay, fine. On top of this, so let me just summarize again this result that I just showed you. These are just the population level estimates that I showed you in the previous slide. I'm just repeating them here. You can also wonder, I told you that having this bias is kind of the optimal thing to do, right, in this task, because it is the thing that gives you kind of better performance. But so maybe the participants are just showing this type of bias because it's they have learned to do well the task, and that's why they have learned to do it, because you're saying that they're doing well when they're actually performing better, and they tend to perform better if they have this sort of bias, right? So as a control for this, we can replicate the whole experiment in a scenario where we instruct explicitly subjects to disregard the simplicity, if you want. Essentially, we ask them exactly to perform maximum likelihood. So we tell them, okay, consider the cloud of dots, try to guess where the kind of center of mass of these dots is, and pick the model that is geometrically the closest. Okay. So the nice thing here is that, and this is replicated with other 200 subjects, a different pool of people. So what the nice thing that comes out of this is that if you do perform this control experiment, essentially the type of result that you get is very similar, right? You basically get the same thing, which means that this particular behavior that we were observing, this preference for simpler models, is not something that depends on the specific detail of, at least of the instructions of our task. I mean, then the quantitative details will, of course, depend on other aspects of how we decided to implement it. Okay, so fine.
So they're miscalculating the center of
Yes. So in this case, the simplicity bias is maladaptive, right? So I mean, I don't know if they're miscalculating. There's a whole literature about asking people to judge center of mass of things, but so I don't know exactly where they think the center of mass is, because that's not what I'm asking them. I'm just asking them, choose one of the two models based on where you think the center of mass is. And basically they do, in terms of their behavior, they essentially do the same thing as the other group of people where I just asked them, I just posed the question in this kind of generative way where I'm thinking, okay, I'm asking, okay, which of the models do you think is most likely to have given rise to the observed data? Okay. So this bias persists even when it is maladaptive. So this probably hints to the fact that it is at least very deeply ingrained in what they're doing. Right. So quick recap so far. So again, this is the kind of main result about the sensitivities. We can say that humans are sensitive to statistical model complexity across multiple model features. The behavioral weighting of different model features is not quantitatively what you expect normatively, right? So this makes us think that, of course, people are probably using some sort of approximation or some sort of, they must be doing, of course, they're not doing the normative thing. I mean, this is hardly surprising. So what are they doing then? I mean, can we say something about what sort of strategy or what sort of heuristic they may be deploying in this sort of task? Okay, so this is what we're going to do next. And in order to do that, we're going to focus just on the dimensionality term, the dimensionality bias, because it's first of all, it's the one that we detected as being the strongest, and also it's like simpler to manipulate and to kind of use in kind of more flexible experimental settings. So we're just going to focus on that. Okay, now a fact of life. The relative importance of the bias depends on sample size. So this is just a statement of the fact that, again, for a moment, going back to the general theory and philosophy, right? We said, oh, it's good to be biased towards simpler explanations, but there's also the sense that if you have, the more data you have, the more complex a model you can afford, right? In general, this trade-off, how much it matters, this trade-off between goodness of fit and complexity will essentially, generally speaking, decrease as you acquire more data. And this is true across multiple kind of versions of this idea of Occam's razor, right? So as we saw in very quickly in one of the initial slides, in the case of Bayesian integration, when you're computing evidences, you know that the log likelihood, which was the first term under expansion, the goodness of fit, typically scales, it's linear in the number of observations, the number of data points, and that term I had for the bias against models with high dimensions was proportional to the log of the number of data points. So what would happen is that in this scenario, the relative penalty, so if you just consider the ratio between these two things, typically, as you increase the sample size, this quantity goes down, right? It just goes down in a particular way, depends on the model. Okay, but then so this is what happens. This is what I expect to see, for instance, if your participants are in their head doing something that looks a little bit like this, maybe doing some complicated Bayesian integration. On the other hand, you can also imagine that they're doing some other much simpler heuristic. For instance, here I've written two, one which is related to the BIC and also one which is related to this other model selection criterion that I was mentioning at the beginning, the AIC. But the idea is always the same, is that you consider some sort of average notion of goodness of fit averaged over the data point, and then you consider, say, the dimensionality of your model, and then you manually kind of weigh them, like you manually scale them based on how many data points you have, right? You kind of manually implement this notion that the more data you have, the less your complexity penalty should matter. So, okay, this is one way of doing it. And in fact, we saw that this BIC thing here is essentially equivalent to first order to what you would get on this side, right? Because you can derive it from there. But the nice twist here is that in this scenario, as an input to your calculation, you don't just need your values of your data points, you also need to kind of explicitly count how many data points you have, right? So it matters here exactly how good you are at perceiving or counting your data. And we know from long strand of literature that people have particular, again, biases of their own just in performing this operation of counting stuff, right? So typically, number object perception tends to be sublinear in the kind of true number of objects that you're considering. This is an old slide. I mean, this is a log. I say sublinear, and then I plot a straight line. This is a log plot, okay, with a non-one slope. And the idea is that, for instance, in a scenario where just showing, I don't know, dots on a screen and asking people how many dots there are, people essentially tend to progressively underestimate the number of dots as the number increases. This is connected to Weber's law. Yes.
How sensitive that is to things like color? You show uniform like gray things and you show dots, and then if you have lots of different colors, I guess this is easily tricked, right? Easily manipulated.
Yeah. I mean, there's all sorts of dimensions you can play with in this context, right? Here I'm talking about the general fact that if you have I mean this. Yes, I agree with you. Like you have many kind of knobs that you can turn when doing
Can
this.
it ever be super? I guess if you put lots of different colors, it's kind of an overestimation rather than. And if you do it comparatively, like you show a grayscale versus color.
I'm sure somebody has done it. Yes, I'm sure, exactly. So, I mean, this is really the basic, really the basic. Right. And the idea is that, of course, if you instead of plugging the true value of n, you plug something that is actually some sublinear function of the true value of n, this relative importance of your bias will also change, right? Because it matters if this is n and that's log n, right? So, and here is just an example with one particular choice of scaling for this heuristic. You could see that this relative penalty would scale different. Okay, fine. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna come up with an experiment that tries to exploit this phenomenon to say something at least about the type of heuristics that people may be employing here.
Yeah,
so, yes.
The previous experiments, if you change the number of data points, do you observe that? Did you actually change the number of seeds?
I did not. Yes, fair question. I did not. The idea of the next experiment is to essentially do that, but focusing only on is essentially getting rid of some of the degrees of freedom of the previous experiment, because here now I'm only going to be focusing on dimensionality. I forget about all the rest and try to simplify things a little bit. Let's see if this worked or not. I mean, it's open to discussion. So this is the second experiment here. We call it the dimensionality task. And now data is one dimensional. So the data, instead of being locations in 2D, is locations in 1D. So they're just the kind of horizontal locations of these vertical bars. And so these vertical bars are generated from a Gaussian mixture model. And the task is I give you something that looks like this, and you tell me how many clusters do you see, basically, like how many. And I think I know the question.
Why are the lines not straight?
Yeah. So yes. So this is to help people kind of prevent, like to help people see them when they're very close to each other, because it makes it easier. Yes. It looks like when when you drop that game where you have to drop the sticks. Yes. Yeah. Right. So I think it's pretty. No, anyway, so the task is you have to tell me how many clusters you see, and you know that this could come from a Gaussian mixture with fixed with fixed variance, where each component has a fixed variance, and I could have 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 components. Okay, so now, unlike the previous scenario where I was testing dimensionality, but really I only had models with like 0 and 1 dimensions, which is fairly restricted. Now at least I have 5 different values of the dimensionality, and then I'm going to perform this experiment with by changing the number of sticks, basically, right? So again, this is done with 100 participants, 900 trials per participant, divided with according to the different amount of data that we're showing and different amount of true the value of the number of components. Okay, so first, participants can do the task. They do it with like around, say, 45% fraction correct on average, which is good considering that the chance here is at 20%. Then first result that comes out of this, just by looking at the data without any particular modeling, is that if you plot the average answer, so the average number of clusters that people say that they see as a function of the sample size, you can notice 2 things. Well, first of all, remember the true value of the clusters was 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And the data the trials was kind of like equally distributed among these conditions. So on average, if somebody was kind of radical and unbiased, the average response should be 3, right? So first of all, the average responses are definitely lower than 3. So typically people tend to kind of underreport the number of clusters here. So, okay, kind of going to, again, like you can interpret this as going towards models that have lower dimensionality. So that's good. And the second thing is that this bias towards models with lower dimensionality decreases. So this average number of clusters reported goes up as a function of sample size. So the more data there is, the larger the number of clusters reported is. So it looks like things are going in the type of direction that we were expecting. Another way of seeing this is by plotting some sort of confusion matrix here, where I'm plotting the true number of clusters here on the x-axis and the average, and the answer of my participants here, and this is just a fraction of answers like that, average overall participants, and we can look at the error patterns here. Of course, first thing you notice is that of course the task becomes harder for larger true number of clusters, and that's fine. But the other thing is that there is this pattern to the errors where people tend to err more towards reporting a number of clusters which is lower than the radical one, right? So there is this push towards reporting lower dimensional models. And again, this idea is supposed to be the razor here. So, and you can dig down further and show, for instance, if you just consider this column, the case where the true number of clusters was 5, you can see that the fraction of trials where the participants responded 4 actually goes up with the sample size, whereas the fraction of trials where participants reported a lower, much lower number of clusters actually goes down. So again, this is all at least conceptually consistent. Yes.
So the total sample size is fixed, right?
The total sample size.
Like the number of sticks they see.
No. That's what changes from trial to trial. So they see. Sorry, I didn't.
Yeah. Okay. So sorry, but what I mean by fixed is that it's you don't draw the same number of sticks from every Gaussian.
And this was one. So what's the distribution?
You get fewer and fewer stakes per peak as you go to a higher number of peaks, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So
No, wait. So in this scenario, yes, you get fewer and fewer stakes per peak as yes.
it doesn't
Yes.
that mean that this shift upwards is correct?
I mean,
That they have an effectively much lower number of samples, so they should be more biased towards the peak.
yes, that's exactly
Okay,
yes, thanks for yes, that's exactly what I was trying to say. So that's the you are yes, they tend to report models that have a lower dimensionality. Yes. Right?
Yeah, but it could also be correct, that's your point.
Exactly. My point is that it's not necessarily a bias, it could be perfectly correct in the sense that this is exactly what you should guess if you have only 5 samples drawn from every peak rather than 10.
But like
So if you draw 60 stakes in total from a
Yes.
2-peak model, you
Yes.
actually have 30 samples per peak,
yes,
but only 15 if you have a 4.
yes.
I'm not sure how you would
No.
quantify that, what you would correctly do in that scenario, but it seems
Uh-huh.
like the correct move to do is move up there.
Yes, but the peaks could be centered in different locations, right?
Yeah, how
Right.
is it done? So how can you go back to the slide?
Yes.
The distribution of the, so how are the?
So yeah, I don't have a plot of the distributions. Well, I mean, the distributions are all peaked uniformly. So there are trials where they overlap, right? There are definitely trials where you have. So for instance, there are trials that look like they're completely ambiguous, and I agree.
Okay.
So there are trials which are like 4.
Variety work.
So in this case, I mean, they will show up. I mean, here in that scenario, yes. But I mean, the idea is that we can quantify this a little bit more, a little bit better, and use
Because
most of the-
your plot on here suggests that the difference between the means are fixed. So they're equally distributed, the means of the modes.
So
The
the
proportions are also equal, and the variances are also equal.
so the distribution of the means is uniform independently for each mean. So the distribution of the distances, I think, is not going to be uniform. But the
Variance in each component.
that's fixed. That's fixed,
And the
and
proportions are equal.
the proportions are equal. Yes.
Do they know that?
Yes, we do run them through some examples and some explanations at the beginning, little tutorial. Yes.
I should say something there is, your claim is not that they're doing something wrong, but that they are actually, by going towards simpler explanation, when you can't say if the explanation is actually complex or simple.
Yeah, but yes, thank you. That's a good way of putting it. In that scenario, in the ambiguous scenario, they would, they could equally likely report for 2, and they choose to say 2. Okay, they could have,
Right.
you could just say 4.
At some point you said that the mean guess should be 3 peaks.
That's just the overall mean peak, mean guess, if you're just considering the fact that there is like the true value of the stimuli is like equally distributed across all 5. Then when
So
you get
what does should there mean? Like who should actually end up at 3?
so I mean
Not a perfect reasoner then.
No, not a perfect-
Patient does not guess 3.
exactly, yes,
Okay,
yes,
right.
yes. So sorry, yeah, by should I mean like
Okay.
naively, I guess.
Right.
Yes. Okay, good. Okay, now, okay, we're almost out of time. I'm just gonna give you the last set of results here of this experiment. Then the way we analyze this data in a more quantitative way is that essentially we consider a whole zoo of possible strategies that they could apply, and we consider how good each strategy is at explaining their behavior. Again, I'm not going to run through all of them. There are many. This is just a modular comparison plot. It doesn't matter. There's like a whole bunch. Each line on this thing is a different strategy. The way you read this plot is that this is a plot of something that measures relative predictive power. So essentially, the idea is that this number here higher is better, and the way these plots connect is that each of them either zoom in. So this one kind of zooms in here, and this one zooms in here. So the idea is that you have, for instance, these three models are quite close to each other, and these are kind of further away, and these are very far away. I will just point out some of these particular strategies that we considered. So L only is, say, just some maximum likelihood, again, strategy where people are just adjudicating the goodness of models based on how close they can get to the data. Then, as I said, we have multiple things called AIC and BIC. This corresponds to the strategies that I was talking about before, but they assume different types of ways in which the number of perceived data points may scale with the true number of data points. I'm going to give you some details in a second. And this one is some other heuristic, which is really just based on the details of the task that I'm not going to dwell too much on. Again, we're just not going to the only thing you have to take away from this is that I'm considering different ways in which the perceived, the different dependencies between your likelihood and dimensionality penalty, and essentially different ways in which these could depend on the amount of available data. So the kind of main takeaway from here is that we're just going to focus on these two models, which are the best descriptions of model behavior, of subject behavior. And again, they look like this, right? BIC, you kind of judge models based on an expression that looks like that. So you're scaling goodness of fit and dimensionality based on, respectively, just the perceived number of data points and the log of that. Whereas in AIC, you're just doing the same thing, but you're not scaling the dimensionality. And notice that they're essentially, like, we cannot really tell which one. I mean, they're not really significantly different in terms of how well they describe the data. So here we don't really know. We have to interpret, at least try to interpret them both. Right. So in this particular models that I'm showing here, this n tilde is actually a flexible function that we infer from subject behavior, right? So we're saying, okay, this is how subjects kind of adjudicate between models, where n is some function, n tilde is some function of n that we also try to infer from behavior. And this is how the function looks like on average. This is the aggregate estimate across all participants. This function has so for the two models, okay? So for both of them, these functions have two essential features that I would like to focus on. One is that they're both sublinear. So in both cases, you have a kind of your inferred dependence on of n tilde over n is sublinear, similar to what I was, at least qualitatively, to what I was telling you earlier. And the other thing is that, yes, it's sublinear, but in both cases, looks like the function is doing something up to n equals 50, and then it's doing kind of something else above 50, right? It's like either dropping in the case of the BIC model, or kind of just flattening out and maybe slightly dropping in the case of AIC. Okay, so I think this is interesting because this whole like this type of result is compatible with what is known from the literature on numerosity perception, in the sense that, yes, I mean, there was this point that I was telling you earlier that numerosity perception tends to be sublinear, but it is also known that it also tends to engage different regimes depending on the particular number of things that you're trying to estimate, and in particular based on things like their density. For instance, it's been documented that people, for instance, use a different mechanism for estimating the number of objects where these are, fairly separated visually, versus when they get much closer, at which point they start just judging things based on density. Okay, so I'm not drawing a quantitative connection here. I'm just saying that the in our task, at some point, the data also gets kind of our sticks also get quite close to each other. Hence, also the trick that we need to do with their orientation. So this is not surprising. I mean, this is again, this is compatible with imagining that our participants are employing some sort of heuristic, which looks either like this or like that, for instance, and which recycles some kind of lower level cognitive primitive, if you want, which is the sense of number, right? Yes.
I mean, but surely when you show them 7 dots, they don't actually think there's only 20, right?
Yes, no.
So here, if you look, the true end is 70, then the inferred end is 20.
Yes.
They don't actually think.
Yes.
They behave as if they would be a perceiving.
Yes, they behave as if, and what I'm saying is that in this regime here, the idea would that they would switch to another kind of strategy, which doesn't involve explicitly counting them, which would just involves estimating some notion of density of the sticks on the screen, and kind of give up caring about the specific number.
You ask them in the experiment to first say how much most they see, and then what their estimation of n is actually.
Yes, we did not. So yeah, that's for the next iteration of the experimental design. Yes, and in particular, no, one thing that is kind of hampering us in testing this idea is that our experimental design also doesn't control for the density. So just because of the random variability of the data from trial to trial, sometimes you get data that is very packed, sometimes it's more spread out. And it would be nice to have a setup where you can kind of control separately the number of data points and their density. So that, for instance, you can see if you could push this kind of more, I would call, better behaved regime of this inferred number of data points to higher values. Yes.
I'm a bit confused actually. So
yes,
but you only did these tests as one value for a true n, right?
Sorry, say that again?
You only, in all these experiments, the true n was actually fixed?
No. The true n went from like 16 to 17. Yeah. So this was, right.
So if I would find this, my first thought would be, especially with green line, this is so absurd that it goes down again. Apparently, they're not using this BIC criterion.
Yeah. Basically, what this is saying is that in this regime, the fact that here we're assuming that there is this one heuristic which works throughout the range. Essentially, what would be nice to understand is that, I mean, this seems to suggest that, you know, this kind of breaks down at some point when you cross some threshold in terms of density of the stimuli. And the proper thing to do would be to figure out exactly how to break down the strategy as well. But with this experimental design, I think it's complicated because you don't control what I think may be the key kind of knob that controls for this. Yes. Okay.
If you were to also penalize for additional complexity terms, like you had before, then this curve will grow in number, right? Because you would have, you would assume a higher n for the same amount of penalty. And so what happens if you, I mean, the question is, what happens if you add the extra complexity term to the more complexity?
Yeah, so we did do that to some extent, and it doesn't dramatically change the picture. But still, again, that's something to be iterated on also at the experimental design level, I think. Yes.
I'm still confused.
Yes.
About the earlier point. If we go back 2 slides, I think. At your point again, but no, one more.
Yeah, it's coming.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah.
So here, true K, that's actually how we simulated it.
Yeah, how I generated the data.
Yeah, but if you now take the most optimal statistical model that does all these things correct, then you also find it bias or not.
You mean, yes, the optimal thing would be to be biased up.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, normatively, you
should compare people to this optimal statistical model, not to the true K, I think. You say that they are biased.
Yeah. So this basically, no, I mean, when I say okay, thank you. So when I'm talking about the bias here is like the bias that, like, it is normative to have a bias in this scenario. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the type of bias that I'm interested in
I
looking
think
at.
we would want to know whether they have more bias than the model.
Yes. So among these models that we tested, for instance, these models here, just called AIC and BIC here, they're just essentially first order, like this BIC here is just a first order approximation to the optimal Bayesian evidence that you should be computing in this scenario. So this, I think, is the closest to what you're saying. So in terms of whether, so what this plot is showing that these other models that I will showing you later, where we allow for some flexibility in how the perceived number of data points is defined, are described much better, the data, than these more rigid ones. Having said that, if you ask how strong the bias is with respect, once you have established that there is a bias and you want to kind of say quantitatively how strong it is, essentially, I mean, it's a little bit tricky to make comparisons, but one thing that comes out of this analysis is that if you want the equivalent to you remember in the previous part of in the first part of the talk, I was talking about sensitivities, right, to the various types of complexity. And if you measure the same thing here, it comes out that you also have a sensitivity to, say, the dimensionality, which is above the one that you expect to see from the normative model. So quantitatively is something like, you need to go by memory with the numbers, but it's of the same order. Like, for instance, say that in the previous experiment, the relative sensitivity was something like, I don't know, 5, here it's 3, something like that. Okay, yeah, where 1 is base. Okay. Okay, so I think I'm done. So we're out of time. Just throw up some conclusions here on the slide. So, just the brain needs to generalize efficiently. Occam's razor is a good idea. We use Bayesian model selection and information geometry to describe these notions of complexity in geometrical term. We did some psychophysics experiments to test whether this theory is a useful normative reference point for human behavior. We found that participants are indeed biased towards simpler models, defined as we do in our theory. And also that Occam's razor persists even when it is maladaptive. And also we have, I've showed you this fact that the running exchange rate, if you want, between simplicity and goodness of fit is best described assuming some sublinear representation of the sample size n. And then this suggests some connection with known, the way in which numerosity perception works in the psychology literature. Okay, so I'm just gonna thank people who worked on this with me. So Shiza Liu at Harvard, Francesco Rinaldi at CISA, and then the N team, Josh Gold, Vijay Balasubramanian, and Pratik Chowdhury. And these are a couple of papers on the topic. Okay, and I thank you all for your attention. Okay. Sorry, I went 5 minutes. Well, actually, I didn't. I did exactly 1 hour because I started at 5 past. Yes.
Really interesting stuff. So I checked with the color stuff. So apparently the color and the numerosity kind of estimation, the spatial group in color is completely different cognitive pathways.
Mm-hmm.
Additive.
Okay.
So if you added color to these things, I don't know what would happen.
Okay.
But the other question I had is when you were talking, so the participants, did you stratify on, were there scientists involved? I'm just wondering if you compared social scientists versus natural scientists, or if you see different.
Okay, we're getting into something that's very specific here. Very, very specific features.
Scientific trading.
Yeah.
I think that's, you say Because I was trying to disentangle whether there's a pre-filtering on the data. So this grouping effect is kind of like a heuristic that humans use to just group information. And then you do the model kind of identification.
Right.
Versus if you didn't do that, and how that would differ based on your training.
Yeah. So what I can tell you about the type of training of our participants is that for both experiments have been piloted with people you can grab off the corridor. So like in populations with like
Corridor at Harvard.
corridor at CISA and Penn. Yes. That would be so people with some amount of scientific training. I can tell you off the top of my head that the first experiment, the one with the dots, right? When we did the pilot, and then all the experiments all the data I presented are from online experiments with very broad populations. I don't really know. I didn't investigate the background, right? I only have very, very basic demographic information about these people. But for instance, I can tell you off the top of my head that the first experiment, when you look at the estimates of the sensitivities that you get, they were quite compatible with what you got with the smaller population with high scientific training. So that's I think that's suggesting that is. Oh, and also, I mean, okay. I was also going to say that, for instance, the first experiment was also replicated twice because of this other variant that we did in the instructions. But I mean, that doesn't really go in the direction you're saying, because it's just could be just a broad population. Yes. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. So thank you very much. It's a very interesting topic. I was also on simplicity of a higher level of cognition. So I was puzzled by your point with respect to the experiment I arrived in already. You started since a while. So in the experiment with the flowers, and
yes,
you were referring to the simplicity type of method compared to the central mass.
Yes.
So the central mass, I mean, it's natural that it helps, because from a descriptive point of view, that's, I mean, the first order approximation.
Yeah,
that's the one that reduces all the errors. So it makes sense if you consider that compared with the NDL. But then if I think about higher level cognition, like it is known that other species, they are not reactive to simplicity. Like baboons, they don't react to geometric patterns and to audio simplicity, while humans, they do. Well, it then triggered me the question, yes, but I do suspect that animals, they're also good in the approximation of central mass, because it's rather important to the mental task. So what's in there? I mean, I don't know. I'm not asking whether you have the answer, but more of a reflection on that, because you were pinpointing something that would look like to be easy, but in reality, pinpointed to a more profound thing there.
Well, I mean, if I got your, maybe let me bring it back. If I got your question right, I mean your observation right. So I'm not suggesting, and tell me if I'm misinterpreting it. I'm not suggesting, for instance, this one. These two settings.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not suggesting that the only thing that is there to performing this task is to just simply estimate a center of mass. Okay. In fact, what the data in science here shows is that even if you do ask people, just try your best to estimate the center of mass and then tell me which one of these two geometrical things is closer to the center of mass, people still don't quite do that. Okay. So they do something else, right? Which is closer to this other operation here, which is try to gauge which one of the two models is the best hypothesis for being, the model that generated your data. Okay. Then statistically, you can still boil this down to a computation which involves the center of mass, the variance of the data, and so on and so forth. But that's just because the sufficient statistics here of this problem are, I mean, these are just Gaussians. But I'm not.
I was more reflecting on, because you were saying, okay, we want to escape from the task that we gave from the experiment,
yes,
and we are going into an exercise that looks like to be let's say, objective out of context in the sense you're just giving the points, pinpoint only to the center of mass of these points.
Yeah.
You know? Then I was referring indeed on this problem that we see that other species, they don't perceive simplicity in pattern, geometric patterns, in auditory patterns, but I do suspect they are good, relatively good in estimating central mass when they are performing practical tasks.
Yeah.
So there is something that here you're using those as comparison, but perhaps there is still something that makes them different. At least as it was more an opening than expecting a question to you. It was more like what we see in a higher level cognition is that there is a distinction between each.
Yeah.
I would suspect.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, the answer is that I don't know. It's very interesting. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
So you started by saying, I'm assuming priors do not actually be important here and will derive Occam's razor just from the likelihoods. I know that a lot of people actually try to encode all intuition about Occam in priors and things like Solomonov priors.
Okay. Yeah.
Are they at risk of doubly correcting for a simplicity bias?
Okay, so here what the point I made about priors, I can expand on that a little bit. Is that so if you take this particular, so if you want to give this kind of geometrical interpretation of this of our Bayesian evidence, so the way in which this comes out nicely is if you assume Jeffrey's prior on your models, right?
Okay.
But the general effect, which in the case of our flower bed experiment is just a uniform prior.
On the parameters.
Yes, with the parameter.
Right. But I'm talking about the prior model.
Of the models, yes. So the thing is that the effect of the if you're doing Bayesian model selection based on this method, I mean the preference for models that are simpler in the way that I described just comes out. It doesn't really depend on the particular priors that you're using. I mean, you can mess with it if you of the parameters. Then I'm going to get to the models to the prior of the models. Then I mean, if you want to encode some other principle on top of that, you're free to do so. I mean, I don't think there is an issue of doubly correcting, because in the end, the moment you're designing a prior for your problem, I mean, that's the assumptions that I mean, here, what I'm saying is that some form of simplicity bias comes out even if you assume a flat prior over models, okay? But then if for some reason you want to be, to weigh more models that satisfy some property of simplicity because or whatever else that you want, I mean, you're free to do so. I don't think it's, I don't think there is an issue of double counting because they're different things. I mean, this is just an effect of the geometry of the problem. Yeah, I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand how you would think of this if you use like a Solomonov prior, because
Right.
then you're kind of mixing parameters and models, because you're saying the prior on my model is its exponential of the Kolmogorov complexity. Yeah. And then you're kind of mixing parameters and models already.
Yeah. So maybe we can take this offline. Let me. Yeah, let's yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about it then. Yeah. Thanks. Okay, other questions?
Yeah, lots.
Yeah.
Did you consider to do this same study in a way that it's a sequential decision-making task? So you just show them points come as in like in the scientific decision-making setup. So you just put on points on the screen. They have to choose between two hypotheses, and then they decide themselves. And they think they have sufficient evidence to go for it's like we do the standard response time studies. And then
Yeah.
That might be an interesting way.
Yes, definitely. I have considered that. I haven't done it yet. Is somewhere on the list of things I would like to explore more. Also because switching to like a sequential setup may allow for easier. For instance, I would be interested in understanding how this play out if you change modality. And if you go in a sequential setting, it's easier, for instance, to work with, say, audio stimuli. So that would also be like a nice side effect of doing that. But yeah, that's a nice direction. Yeah.
So what do you think would happen if you would turn the task around? If you say, here are two distributions, now draw points from them.
Okay.
With this decision boundary, for example, would they like artificially increase the variance of simple flower beds?
So what they will do, I think, is that basically, okay, let me bring up this thing again.
Because I mean, in your head, you would probably turn it around, saying, okay, if I would have to draw dots from this distribution, I would draw them up until around here.
So basically, what I would expect is that, what you would normatively expect, which is partially satisfied here, is that they would, just because the task here would be, okay, draw dots from locations that can be either, I don't know, sampled somewhere along this line or sampled here. So I would expect them to like basically sample dots all around here, and this would result in like some cloud of dot, which is like this. Whereas this one would be a cloud of dot, which is more concentrated around here, which means that if you give them like two different markers, the green marker and the pink marker, here there would be more pink dots, because the amount of pink dots is the evidence, right? The moment you're integrating over the location of the thing,
they could invert it, and they would oversample.
Well, yeah, they would there would be more pink dots there. I mean, that would be the intuition again. But I mean, I don't think this is feasible. But yes, yeah.
We looked at a little bit different, not really in a study, but you can also just show people the frequency distribution correctly. And then one amazing observation is if you just show them a frequency distribution, a bimodal one or three-modal one, but you don't tell them what's on the y-axis, so what the frequency actually is. People just give judgments, but it completely depends, of course, on is this 10,000 data points or 5 data points. They don't ask. Just say, oh no, three models, two models. So yeah, okay, maybe this is not really an experiment we really did, but I saw that repeatedly that people just give these judgments without even knowing what n is, which is amazing.
Yes, there is some interesting work in that direction by the group of Tanya Lombroso, who has for a long time studied, this sort of simplicity bias, and in a more like kind of like tabular settings, if you want, like where there are little problems of like decision making, with and they have played with talking about probabilities or talking about frequencies and this sort of things. And I mean, they have also in those scenarios, they also detect bias person.
Because the other thing is that if you manipulate people's priors for a more complex model, that's also something you can test here. But if you tell them somehow, probably is four modes, then they are quickly that also has a big impact on people's judgment. So that's also something you can easily now test in this setup.
Yes, you can play with like understanding how much you have to put your thumb on the scale for kind of maybe some of these effects disappear. That's another way of measuring that. Yes. Okay. Well, then yes, I think I kept enough. Thank you so much.